Well, welcome everybody to the August session of Ask the Editors. My name is B. Morris Allen, or just Morris Allen. I'm the editor of Metaphorosis, which is an online science fiction and fantasy magazine. We publish new stories once a week, as well as monthly print and electronic issues and all sorts of anthologies over the year. I'm going to let everybody else go around and introduce themselves who's on the panel, and then we'll just go ahead and jump into the questions. Walt, let's start with you.
Okay, I'm Walt, boys. I have edited both nonfiction and fiction magazines for 25 years, I think. I was the editor of the Grantville Gazette until Eric Flint passed away. And now I am editor of Novus Mundi Publishing, which is a new science fiction, fantasy, and alternate history imprint. And I'm trying to talk my new boss into letting me run a magazine for him.
Okay. We'll look forward to seeing that whenever you get that decision.
Yeah.
Kanika.
I'm Kanika Agrawal. I'm fiction editor at khōréō, which is a publication for immigrant and diaspora authors. We publish 4 issues a year, and for 2022, we've been nominated for Best Semi-Prosine for the Hugos, so we're excited about that.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I also edit at a couple of other literary magazines that where we don't have any sort of clear boundaries, between literary and speculative. So sometimes we will publish work that might be considered of a literary speculative nature. For example, Conjunctions, where I'm on staff, has published work by Karen Russell and Kelly Link and a number of other people who sort of straddle that literary speculative, what is often a divide. And I myself come from a literary background. So if there are any questions about that, I'm happy to answer.
Okay. Wendy.
Hi, I'm Wendy S. Delmater. I am the editor of Abyss and Apex magazine. Abyss and Apex has been around since about 2003. I've been running it since 2006. And we decided to take some lemons we'd been handed and turn them into lemonade, because we are alphabetically one of the first places that new writers sent their things. We specialize in finding new talent. We work with new writers. About 25% of our authors, it's either their first sale or their first publication. And that has its own special challenges, but it's a lot of fun. And we do a 50-50 mix of science fiction and fantasy, as well as some good speculative poetry, a lot of award-winning stuff. I know how having a Hugo nomination feels. Best of luck, and best of luck. It's a wonderful feeling, and it's an honor just to be nominated. The thing that I'm most proud of we've gotten into recently, and recently is like the last 8 years, is we were the first place to ever do small press book reviews. Strange Horizons does them, but they're more specialty, like it's, let's look at this LGBTQ or biopic or whatever. And we just are interested in good stories. And we will occasionally, if we've already published the author for their short fiction, we'll look at their indie books. But I believe that small presses are a big part of the future of the genre, because small presses help people choose between too many choices. If I like this thing that they published, I might like that thing. So that's why we do that.
Okay. Let's go ahead and leap in then. I'm going to ask you each, in the participants, the first time you speak up, go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself, what Are you a writer? Are you interested in long fiction, short fiction, that kind of thing? But let's leave that to when you first speak up. So, questions. Be brave.
Me?
No. Well, you as well. You certainly can. But anybody in the audience.
Hmm.
Yeah, hi.
I
Oh,
go,
okay.
go, go.
Yeah, hi, my name's Marcy. I live in Brooklyn. I write speculative fiction, short stories, novels. I've been published a little bit here and there by places like Diabolical Plots and Daily Science Fiction. And for a while I had luck, and then I go, thank you very much, never darken our doors again, kind of rejection. And lately I've been getting a lot of either we liked it, but no, please send us more, or very, very personal rejections, quoting things and we loved it. Our editors cried, but no. So
I'm sorry. I
no,
feel
it's funny.
for you.
It's funny. I mean, I love the personal rejections because it means they really liked it. But I'm just trying, I guess for some reason the piece didn't fit or is missing some particular thing. And I'm always trying to figure out, like my last rejection said, the prose is beautiful. The editors cried, but it didn't do it, it didn't fit in. So I'm just wondering what the doesn't fit in means for you. So
Walt, you want to take that first?
Sure. It could mean a number of things. If they got to the point where they were actually quoting your prose back at you, it wasn't a nice pat on the head, go away, and it's a real think about this really hard rejection. Generally, what it means is literally you didn't fit into what they were trying to do for their current issue, or if you're submitting to an anthology, what the anthology's theme is, or something like that. If you get a personal signed rejection that's really detailed, I would be inclined to write back and say, okay, I thank you for your comments. Could I have a little bit more information? I'm always willing to do something along those lines. Not if it's a thank you for your submission in crayon. No, thank you. But if you don't kid yourself, I've gotten a couple of those. When I was editing textbooks, I got one written on foolscap, yellow foolscap with a vermilion pen in longhand by a very famous Indian scientist. And I had to type it all out because I was told we were going to buy it.
Was it good?
When I got done with it, it was.
Fair enough.
But I'm not sure I was the person who made it good. I just made it readable. So does that make any sense?
yeah. I mean, I don't want to harass editors, by
Well, I don't
Always
think
wise.
you
kind of a
would be.
thing. Yeah.
I don't think you would be. If they went to the trouble of writing you a very detailed rejection, they're trying to help you figure out what you're doing wrong.
So I
just
could
hope
ask
to-
them, like, what do you feel was missing, or if you have time, kind
Yeah,
of.
just
Okay.
a very nice email saying, if you have time, I'd really like to talk about this. Is there some time when we could where we could text each other or meet on Zoom or who knows what? And if the answer is no, that's fine. I'm not stalking you, but not now anyway.
I wouldn't leave with
but-
that.
No, but you got, otherwise you're stuck throwing the I Ching, and that's rejectomancy is not one of the things that I'm real fond of, because you don't know. I'm much more blunt than most people are when I reject something. I tell you exactly why I rejected it and what you have to do to fix it. On the other hand, I'm not getting 300 or 400 submissions a day either.
Wendy, what's your take?
Thank you.
Well, it's interesting you should bring up rejectomancy. We actually did an editorial by that name, which talks about our process. And it's actually rather funny because what it does is it's haikus. And we had to put a disclaimer on it because people were wanting haikus with their rejections after this. Okay. Burnt manuscript has gotten on my hot dog. I must eat your words. That sort of thing. Petals from heaven, white envelopes cover me. Thanks, but not for us. Okay. So what does it all mean? I'd rather you bent your brain to writing more stories. And to answer your question, the short version is write the next thing. And if you have an author who, an editor who really wants to give you some feedback, that means you need to submit to this person again. It means not only do they wish you well, but they're willing to spend a little time to show you that they wish you well. All right. So our various levels, and I'm not going to read the whole thing because we have time here. The story might be extremely well written, but might not be right for that particular magazine for any number of reasons. And one of the most frequent ones is editor taste. And that's like, you like pistachio ice cream and I like chocolate. It's just taste. You can't get around that. If you have somebody who's doing a personalized rejection, it means that they like the taste and they're encouraging you to send you more by doing that. Okay. And then there might be a great story, but they can't see an easy fix in a rewrite. Okay. And these things, you can study on them, grounding, tightening places in the manuscript where things get confused or dragged. Noting where we stop reading is something that seems to help people. But the main thing that drives new writers nuts, and remember, that's our specialty, is dealing with new readers, is we'll tell them it needs to be cut by a third. And they throw their hands up in the air and you can just about hear them screaming, what third? Okay. And all I can say is the more you write, the better you'll get at it. So the answer is always write the next thing.
Thank you.
Kanika?
We are, if we say, please send us more work, we mean it. If we say, we really like this, but it didn't work for this issue, we mean it, right? We are an all volunteer staff. We're not looking to take on more work just for the sake of politeness. So we're not going to say, send us more work if we don't mean it. We also, we find, and I think this is true across publishing, that when we encourage people to send us more work, or in some cases, we will offer the option to revise and resubmit, in which case we will actually have more of a conversation with that writer about, what we think might make the story a better fit for us. Often women, and especially women of color, will be less likely to take us up on that offer, because I think there can be some concern about whether it's a genuine offer, and if the work is good enough, etc. So, you know, if I'm talking to a writer that belongs to a marginalized group, I have to make sure to make very clear that this is real. We really want to hear from you again. We want to see more work from you. Please send us more work. Because as I said, we don't really have that time to spend on someone unless we are excited by their work. Also, I would say that there's work we get that is perfectly fine for another magazine. We're not trying to make you change your style or your concerns in your work, the kinds of things that are exciting to you as a writer. You know, if it seems like, oh, okay, yeah, we see what this writer is doing, it's just not for us, and it's better for them to submit elsewhere than for us to try to rework this piece or this writer into something that would appeal to us more. So I think it's also just about having good familiarity with the markets that you're submitting to. I know some people take a kind of like approach of just, well, I'll just send it everywhere and maybe something will stick. You see that less, I think, in on the literary side, because if people are using Submittable, there's often like a small fee, like a $3 fee per submission, and that discourages that. But in the spec world, where magazines are not charging anything for submissions, sometimes you can just get work from people who clearly have no idea what your publication is about. And if you sort of, I'm not saying this is the case for you, I'm just sort of speaking broadly, but if the writer hasn't sort of bothered to do the work to familiarize themselves with the magazine, then I'm less inclined to give them even more of my time to say, hey, this is really interesting work for someone, just not for us.
Yeah,
Thank
I mean,
you.
I would add that some of those people are pretty easy to weed out. The people who don't read the guidelines. In our case, the people who don't get the name of the magazine right. It's a little bit odd. It's hard to spell. We have a little note that says, please don't send us werewolf and time machine stories. We get a lot of werewolf and time machine stories. So those people are clearly not paying a lot of attention. We don't have any themes. So the specific feedback you're getting, if it didn't fit, is not something that we would give. On the other hand, we require a rewrite from pretty much everybody that we publish. That's just part of the process that we go through. So if we see something that, I think this story is close, I think we can work with this, you'll get a rewrite request, and it's up to you whether to pursue that. And I give brief, blunt feedback to people who request it. And these days, it used to be with everybody. These days, it's only for the folks that I feel I can say something useful about. There's just not enough time to give feedback to everybody anymore, unfortunately. I guess I would counter a little bit that that's the feedback that I give is pretty much all I have to say. So if you contacted me and said, can you tell me more about this? I wouldn't have anything to add. I mean, I would try, but I read, a dozen or 20 stories a day. By the time you get back to me, I'm going to have forgotten your story. And so it would be a fair amount of work to go back, read the story again, look at what I said, figure out what else I could say. It's probably not going to happen, well-intentioned as both sides might be. But if I think I want to second what others have said. If you're getting that kind of feedback, I think it's probably just that you need to find the right fit. You need to find the editor in the magazine that works. You've got good prose, you've got a good story, but it's not what they're looking for. And I get some of that. I get horror stories. We don't publish horror, so I'm not going to publish that no matter how great a horror story it is. That's just not what we do. Or we get a certain number of stories that are just not speculative at all. They're great stories, but that's not what we do. So your case, I presume, is not as extreme as that, but You want to find somebody that your story resonates with, and that is what they're looking for. So it may just be a matter of keep trying different outlets. The fact that you're getting this kind of feedback, though, is great, and certainly ought to make you feel good.
It does. Thank you. Thank you.
Sure. Other questions?
Hi. I'm Kanika Covert. I write as Kate Covert, and Wendy S. Delmater is my editor. And it's really nice to see all of you and listen to you. I had written a question, but for the life of me, I couldn't find it. I thought I emailed it back at your request. But so my question, how do you deal with overly political content in a piece when everything else is good? And maybe especially when it's contrary to the editorial POV. Do you request a rewrite, or do you offer guidance? Thank you.
Kanika, do you want to start that?
Yeah, it's a tricky question. I mean, I think, I think all work has a politics of some sort. If the politics are very overt, it depends on whether they are overt and still complex, or whether there's a kind of, like one note that's being struck again and again. And that one note, even if it aligns with editors' perspectives or the kind of general vision of the magazine, is not likely to appeal to us. We are looking for something that is thoughtful in its approach to controversial or political subjects, and that is also making us rethink what we think we already know when we read it. There are sometimes cases where we feel like we think that because our magazine is specifically for immigrant and diaspora writers, we are, aware of what that comes with in terms of the sets of experiences the writers may have had, and also the, what our readers are interested in. If we feel that a story is exploring something that is of interest, that is complex, that we may not, that individual editors may not completely agree with, but the story is not didactic or polemical, right? It is a genuine exploration. Then we're definitely open to that, and we might just have a conversation with the writer about, what is it that you're interested, or what kinds of questions are you interested in raising here? We, as I said before, we're not trying to change who writers are, and the kind of work that they're interested in, the kind of questions that they're interested in. So if we have concerns about that, if we think the story is really interesting, then we'll talk that through with the writer. And sometimes we will say that, this part, the rhetoric in this part is doesn't really work for us, even if it's coming from a character that is meant to be, unlikable, or a kind of villain figure. There's this question of, when are you questioning violence or forms of oppression or marginalization, and through your work, and when are you just reinscribing that in the work by repeating it? And it's a conversation we have amongst the editors a lot as well when we come across work that raises those questions for us. I wouldn't say there's a single approach to that. It is very much on a case-by-case basis. But we do try to approach it as thoughtfully as possible, and we're not, you know, we don't have a kind of checklist of, you know, is this, does it meet these sort of political perspectives? Yes, we'll consider it. Yeah, our hope is that the work is thoughtful and complex, and that we are thinking about it and addressing it in a thoughtful and complex way.
Thank
Walt?
you.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Kanika. She said something important too. She said if it's not too didactic, there's a tendency when you're writing about politically charged issues to become very didactic and preach rather than tell the story. And I've never rejected a story because it was too political. For God's sake, Star Trek is about as political as you can get. And if you don't think so, you haven't been watching. The thing that you have to do is to remember that what you set out to do was to tell a story. And as long as you keep telling the story, then however politically charged it is, from whatever side of the political spectrum it is, isn't going to matter because it's going to be subsumed into the story.
That was a great response. Thank you.
Wendy, go ahead. You're muted.
I would like to add something. A story requires a conflict. And when you're doing one note, as Kanika was talking about one note, what you're doing is you're saying this is right and everything else is wrong. There's no conflict. And therefore, it's not so much that it's too political, either right, left, or sideways. I don't care. It's that you don't have that conflict if you're harping on one point of view politically. That's all.
Yeah, I mean, I would say pretty much the same as everybody else has said. Most message or overly political stories are just too heavy-handed, and the story doesn't work. And it's just not interesting to read. And that's equally true. We're a vegan-friendly magazine. I'm a vegan for many, many years. And the pro-vegan stories that I get that are really heavy-handed are just as bad. I appreciate where they're coming from. I think the message is terrific. I wish everybody thought that way, but it's not a good story. It's not fun to read, and we are an entertainment magazine. We publish some things that are pretty political, and I don't care, frankly, which side they're on, as long as it's not actively offensive. If you're saying rah animal experimentation, that's probably not going to work for me. But otherwise, I don't much care. But I'm not very interested also in really topical stories. Lots of stories about Trump or the Pumpkin King or that. I'm not interested in that. That's too recent and too topical for me to want to publish. If you want to write about the policies of one particular administration or another, but not link them to the administration, great. You want to talk about climate change or abortion policy or right to life, whatever, that's fine, as long as there's a real story in it. Other questions?
I had a question. I'm Tammy, and I was just wondering, what is it that writers can do that get you all really excited to read a short story?
Walt, you want to take that?
Oh my. Grab me with the first paragraph. If you can grab me with the first paragraph, because the way I read stories, before the advent of computers, I used to edit with a big red pen. And I learned this from Tony Weisskopf and Jim Bain. You draw a line on the manuscript in red pen where you stop reading. And too many times I have had to draw that line after the first paragraph. Mm-hmm. And it's not because I wanted to. My point of view when I look at somebody's submissions is I want them all to be really good because I want to publish everything. And I have to go, no, not really. So do start in medias res. Do not do a bunch of as you know Bobs. You know what those are. For anybody who doesn't know, in medias res is Latin for in the middle of things. And staff meetings are the stuff of incredible boredom in a story, especially if it's a short story and not a novel. You can get away with a paragraph or two of staff meeting in a novel, but in a short story, every word has to contribute to the ending. Every word. And if you don't, then take that word out. I very often go through my own stuff and take out all the adverbs. Whether I love them or not, I take them out. Because adverbs don't always contribute a whole lot. And then I go back and see if I need one. Do something with your story that makes me like the characters, even if it's an axe murderer. My wife Joy Ward is a social psychologist and a consumer psychologist, and she says that after interviewing over 10,000 people about their intimate beliefs, she has never met a person who believes that they are a bad person. So even if you're writing about a heinous mass murderer, you have to give that nice axe murderer something human to be nice about. It and make your story move. If you're writing a 5,000 word story, make it move. You need to get from the beginning to the end. Bud Sparhawk said that you should only handle one idea in a short story. And maybe, but it's better than not. It's better to try to do that than not. Am I helping?
Yeah, that is helpful. So when you are reading something and they have a great opening first paragraph and they start in medias res, are there anything else that they might do that would make you sit on the edge of your seat and finish it? Or
yes, if you don't have it, there's a thing I call white room syndrome. What white room is you know where they are, you know what the ambiance around them is, but you haven't told me. And so your characters are sitting in the air in a white room. You haven't even told us how the chairs look or if they are on chairs. For all I know, they could be sitting on barber poles. White room disease is the thing that gets more stories rejected by me than almost anything else. Of course, spelling and grammar work really well to get, but those are the things that if you really are careful about, you'll probably sell some stories.
Wendy, you look like you wanted to add something.
Well, he's talked about getting grabbed at the beginning. Do you know what a hook is? A hook is, within the first paragraph, a question that you raise in the mind of the reader, so they have to read forward to answer the question. It can also be a what the hell moment. Something incongruous that just is not, the incongruity, it doesn't fit, something's really off. Why is that? Which is another question. The other thing that will make it so that I will reject a story is I don't want to read 5 paragraphs only to find out that the person, because I assume they're like me. I assume a male is reading and thinks it's a male, an older person thinks it's an older person, a younger person thinks it's a younger person, female thinks female, black thinks another person's black when they're reading, white thinks white. They just assume it's like me. And I have made assumptions, and then I find out 5 or 6 paragraphs down that the person is a different age, sex, or gender than I was expecting, or all 3, and it throws me out of the story. So you need to establish who the person is, and not by saying, the young pretty ingenue waltzed into, no, what you say is she was worried about the train of her new dress, that she would trip going into this important interview, something like that, something where it's worked into the narrative, but you need to let them know who the person is. There's an old newspaper thing where they would say you need to tell who, what, where, when, and why. Why is motive? You can work down to that later, although it's great to have it in the beginning. Here's my conflict. I need to solve it. That's my why, if I'm the character. But if we don't even know who the person is, we're walking in with a huge handicap. So please tell me who it is.
Kanika?
I don't know that I have any advice that you would consider useful on this, because I think that I think sometimes what editors say that they're looking for, and what actually appeals to them, I think there can be a bit of a gap between that, in that sometimes we don't even know our own preferences or behaviors that well. There can be a lot of idiosyncratic reasons that that somebody keeps reading your story or not. Because we have multiple editors on the staff, and we all talk about the stories together, but then we decide who's going to take on which story, and not all of the editors necessarily agree on, like, if one editor is really committed to a story, then we're going to say, all right, go ahead and run with it, even though I'm kind of meh on that story, right? And sometimes somebody will say, oh, I'm a sucker for second person stories, so I'm more likely to keep reading if it's second person. But then you may have somebody else on the staff who says, I'm immediately skeptical of second person stories. So I don't like to, and I would say because we are interested in work that is although we publish, I guess, what could be considered more conventional speculative fiction, or fiction that follows certain ideas, certain tropes, or certain traditions of what speculative fiction is, we are also really interested in questioning the boundaries of what speculative fiction is, there are at least a couple of us on staff who are very interested in experimental forms and hybrid work. So, for example, I might be really interested in a story that seems to, that starts off really slow, right? That takes its time, that doesn't have a climax at all. I would say for me personally, and this is not, again, this is just, for me, For me personally, the thing that will always engage with me with a story is the language, right? So on the level of the sentence, on the level of the word, is the writer doing something interesting with language? Is it an unexpected use of language? Is it unusual sentence structure? That will always engage me, and I will keep reading, even if in other ways the story may not seem that interesting. And that tends to be my personal bias, is that, I mean, I think, you know, as Walt was saying, we want everything we read to be good, right? We're not looking to be like next. So, you know, as soon as I start reading a story, I'm like, okay, like this, you know, this is going to be great, right? And sometimes, in spite of whatever limited time I may have, I will just keep reading in that hope, right? If I find like one thing, like one exciting sentence in the first couple of paragraphs, I'll be like, oh, well, there's something here. I'm going to keep reading. We also, you know, we're not getting thousands of submissions per submission period. So for now, I have the luxury of doing that. But yeah, I think it's good to, again, it's good to know who you're submitting to, right? So I think that there are publications where you can see certain trends across all of their stories, and you can say, okay, you know, all of these stories have that hook. All of these stories have these features, you know, early on in the story. So I know that if I'm sending my work here, I should probably do something along those lines. Or if I don't want to do something along those lines, I shouldn't send my work here, right? In our magazine, we list which editor worked on which story. So you can also take a look at that and say, you know, well, these are the stories that most align with my style, with my interests. And, you know, who's the editor that's working on these stories? If I want to appeal to them, here's probably what I should incorporate into my story. All that said, I want writers to do what they want to do, right? So I'm, you know, I feel like it's more about finding the editor and the publication that aligns with the writing you do than making changes in a kind of superficial manner to try to appeal to a particular publication or editor.
I would echo what much of what other people have said. There are a lot of things that you need to do. I'm not so keen on necessarily the first sentence. I don't believe in the magic of the first sentence that some people do. But I think that first paragraph has to do, or the first couple of paragraphs have to do quite a bit. And I tell you, the comments that I make, I take notes on every story for my own purposes, and so that I can give feedback if I feel that I have something useful. And the things that come up most often are context. As Walt said, there's just not enough context. You don't understand what's going on, what's happening, who the people are, the white room syndrome, I guess. And the interesting thing about that to me is that some writers recognize that they have this problem, and they try to solve it with an info dump. They're like, okay, I need to get all this information in. Here it is, right here in one block. Not only is that not very fun to read, it very rarely solves the problem. I find that I read these info dumps, I'm like, okay, I know more about the political whatever, but I still don't know who these people are and what they're doing. So that's, if you have an info dump, usually in my experience, it's a sign that you're not providing the right context. Not that you're doing it in the wrong place, but you're just not providing enough of it. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that most often comes up is whether it's engaging, whether the characters are engaging. And here I don't mean really necessarily whether they're likable, but whether they're interesting to me. Do I know what they value is my shorthand for it. If I know what the character values, if they're an axe murderer and they really get a big kick out of cutting people's heads off. All right, I know something about this character. I don't like them much, but they're an interesting character maybe. And then, so if you get a few of these things going in that first paragraph, you're likely to hit the right zone. The other thing, of course, is it has to be interesting. It doesn't have to be, but if you have a really engaging character with beautifully written prose, and we know that the conflict is, does he go to his 9 o'clock staff meeting? Well, that's not probably going to be an exciting story. Now, maybe if you've got really terrific characters and beautiful prose, maybe you can make a good story out of that. But generally, it's got to be some sort of an interesting topic. And for me, at least, I'm very keen on lyrical prose. So if you've got great prose going in, that's going to keep my attention for quite a while on the story. And the trick of that is, of course, all editors want something different. I don't want Hemingway. I'm not very interested in that kind of, to me, choppy writing. I want Patricia McKillop or Roger Zelazny or somebody like that. But it's also easy to get into that and then overwrite. And so you've got to find that balance. The good news is, once you get into the swing of it, it sounds like, oh my God, I've got to introduce the people. I've got to show what they value. I've got to make it interesting. I've got to set up the problem. I've got to do the prose. If you're doing it right, it's really actually pretty easy to do all those things at once in the first paragraph, once you're used to it. It's if you're trying to go down a checklist and say, well, did I hit all these things? That's probably not going to work. So it's just practice. But my short answer to your question is great prose would get me going.
That's great. Thank you, everybody. And also, I just wanted to mention, Metaphorosis gave me some great personal feedback about 3 years ago, and it helped me get my first short story published.
Okay.
So I wanted to say thank you for that. And Wendy, you have a story of mine coming out, I think, in January. So thank you very much for that, too.
Well, I'm glad to hear it. One thing I'll put in a plug for, and that we do, because we don't offer everybody feedback anymore, we do still offer what I call overview feedback. That is for people who've been rejected by us over 5 times. Then write to us, and I'll look at 5 of your stories, whichever ones you want that you've submitted to us, and say, here's what I see overall in your stories that's not working for me. And again, every editor is different, so you're getting my feedback about what's not working for me, but it can be helpful to say, look, in every story that you've written, you've got problems with the characters. That's useful input, potentially. Anyway. Other questions? I heard somebody speak. Oh, okay. Anybody who hasn't spoken up yet or go ahead, Marcy.
Yeah, so I have always have questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would like to ask or talk about the fictionness of stories. There's things that are sort of slightly speculative, there's magic realism kind of stuff, there's weird, and I know that some places are more science fiction, more hard science oriented, and some are more like Beneath Ceaseless Sky. They don't want technology, so each place has its sort of attitude. But I'm wondering about your thoughts, because in terms of like things like magic realism, I know like in Latin American literature, where the idea comes from, it's not that things are magical, it's just that reality is sort of weird and magical. So as American publishers, how do you think about that and genre, and how much of speculativeness do you need personally to think a story fits your genre needs, I guess, if that makes sense?
I'm going to go ahead and start with that one. We need a certain, it's not a very definitive answer, but we need a certain amount of speculativeness. And it doesn't have to be a lot, but there has to be some element to it that is central to the story. It can't be that, they're going to the staff meeting and the guy says, I saw a witch one time, and then they go on with their staff meeting. There has to be something central to it. But I'm looking at a story right now, considering whether to offer a rewrite that in some ways is really just, they're using an extended metaphor that happens to be a fantastical metaphor, but it could be a real world story. And it's a great story. So that might work for me. And there have been a couple of occasions when I've turned down stories and said, look, there really isn't anything speculative in this. It's a great story, but other than, mixing some potions which aren't really magical, they're just special tea, it's not really speculative. And there's a couple of those that prey on my mind. They're like, that was a great story. I really should have published that story, even though it wasn't quite speculative. So for me, I guess our threshold is fairly low. There ought to be something about the story that is really speculative or that hints at the speculative in some central way, but it doesn't have to be full on wizards and spaceships. So, Kanika.
Yeah, I would say we publish a range in terms of how much speculation there is in a particular story. We also feel like the speculative elements have to be serving some important purpose in the story. Even if you have speculative elements throughout, if they're sort of just there as a kind of window dressing, we're not interested in that. I mean, I think what we're interested in is the particular kind of thinking that that speculative work can generate, right? So what is it that speculative work does that non-speculative work doesn't do, right? So we're thinking about that. But we do have conversations often amongst editors about, is this really a speculative story? That is also to some extent a conversation about what is a shared reality in a certain community, and what would be considered speculative for that community, right? We want to be wary of work that presents a set of beliefs as speculation when that community itself would consider that to be their reality, for example. Yeah, I would say it's an ongoing conversation. We're certainly, we certainly are not looking only for things that fall very firmly within established genres. And we do get quite a lot of work that raises those questions about, is this speculative or not for us? For us, I would say, if you're not sure, send it to us. Because we are interested in where that line lies, and we are interested in reading work that might be doing speculation in unexpected ways. Again, as I keep saying, it's about knowing the publication, right? And what their brand of the speculative is.
Okay. Walt.
I was hoping that you'd let Wendy go first.
Okay, Wendy.
Okay. We define speculative fiction as fiction that contains something that cannot happen in real life. It's a very simple definition, but if you think about it, it really simplifies, at least for us, what we mean by speculative fiction. Although I do know of somebody that sent something about speculating in the financial markets because they thought that's what it meant. No. The other thing is, if you remove the speculative element, and Kanika touched on this, then the whole story falls apart. It has to have that element and has to be central to the story. So we will accept ghost stories, for example, because I don't believe in ghosts, okay? If you believed in ghosts, you might say, well, that's not speculative enough. But it's a really simple definition, and it really helps me just say, when I'm sending a rejection, this is a marvelous story. You should send it here, there, or the other thing, but not to us, because we need things that have an element of something that cannot happen in real life.
Okay. Walt, did you want to add anything, or you want to?
Yeah, I do. But I wanted to give Wendy a chance to go before me, because she says brilliant things, and I don't want her to wind up being third all the time. There's a bunch of tropes that could be said not to be speculative. Cowboys in space. But it is. If you look at Firefly meets the criteria, and not just because they run around in a spaceship. It's because their social discussion, their political discussion, all of those things come to be speculative. And it goes back again to the pulpit that I keep pounding about. Make it it's all about the story. And if you can write something that is a weird Wild West, which is very, very popular now, that can be speculative as all hell. If you just make it Marshall Dillon and Miss Kitty with a ghost, I'm not so sure about that, but it could be. Depends on how good your ghost is.
I want to throw in.
Speculative.
Go ahead.
Speculative is what your editor thinks it is.
I point out that we published at least one story about financial speculation that was great. Of course, it had aliens in it, but still financial speculation. Other questions? I have the list of topics that sometimes get addressed. So if nobody speaks up, I'm going to pick one from there.
I have another question. I could ask you questions all night, actually.
Okay,
but,
go to it.
What are some things that you all are seeing recently that you've just seen too much of, like vampires a few years ago?
Wendy, I'm going to let you go first because apparently I haven't done that. But you do need to unmute.
Thank you very much. Well, there are two categories. One of them is when a themed anthology goes out, and hundreds of people wrote stories for this anthology, and you can almost tell what it was about because you have 50 to 70 stories about vampire unicorns. There must have been a vampire unicorn anthology, and these people didn't get in. And I might publish one if it's really good, but if there are 50 or 70 of them, you really ought to let that rest for a while and not just send it out right after they say, no, we didn't take it for the anthology. And I think I'll leave that for now. I may have something else later, but go.
Okay. Kanika.
Oh, no, I remember what it was. News. Right after 9/11, there were nothing but 9/11 stories, 9/11 stories, 9/11 stories. It was all people working out their angst. I am not your therapist, okay? And I had the same thing happen with COVID. People working out their angst, writing stories about how they were dealing with it, and they were either thinly veiled or not veiled at all. And when your inbox is full of the same exact thing, even if it's brilliant, and every other editor an inbox is full of the same thing, you really ought to let it go. I bought one 9/11 story, and it was because I had the author put it in San Francisco instead of New York. And when he changed a few things to make that work, all of a sudden it wasn't a 9/11 story anymore, and I published it.
Kanika.
Yeah, I would definitely echo what Wendy said about work coming to us right after it's been rejected by a publication that had a theme. You know, and it's also worth thinking about if the vampire unicorn anthology didn't take your vampire unicorn story, how likely is it to be a fit for this publication that you're sending it to now, right? Now, maybe they didn't take it because it was like too experimental or whatever, in which case, sure. But I think it's good to pause and think about, okay, you know, if this story that was written specifically for this anthology wasn't taken by this anthology, then, you know, what other publications could potentially be a good fit for it? And as Wendy said, maybe I don't send it out immediately, both to give myself some time to think it over, and because, you know, the editors are likely flooded with this type of story. I don't know if there was like a Mothman anthology recently, but you know, we got like 3 Mothman stories in one submission period. You know, and then that was unusual, and because that's not a type of character or creature that is that commonly seen. I would say for us, it's not so much that we're necessary, other than, you know, when things are coming to us after a theme-based publication, it's not necessarily that we're seeing too many stories that have the same kinds of creatures or topics, but more that their structure, the way they move through the story is very familiar, you know, so it's like, oh yes, I know it's good, you know, these are the beats that this story is going to hit, right? And so there's no sense really of discovery as you're reading the story. You know kind of what's the journey that story is going to take you on. You kind of already know it, you know, after the first page. I think it's more that we see that a lot, where the story just feels very familiar in terms of how it moves through the narrative, and especially the kinds of emotional reactions it's trying to provoke. You know, like, yes, I see how this piece of dialogue, you know, this dialogue exchange here is supposed to serve this function in this story. When you are so aware of how the story is trying to get you to react, and it's not an experimental or metafictional story, then that's something that's, you know, like, I know this story, right? I don't know this story, but I know this story, right? And I would say it's that we see more often.
Walt?
The number of they're not really copycats, but to a certain extent, that's what they look like. Because they could write a perfectly good urban fantasy in general is really, really tired now. And it's gotten to the point now where it's got to be urban fantasy romance in order to really get attention. And how many times can you write about a vampire who is not very believable as a living, breathing person? And how can a vampire be a good lover because they don't have a circulation system? And there are tropes like that get real tired, and you have to put them on their shelf and let them wait for a few days, months, weeks, or years until you can take another look at something and make it fresh again. if you see that publishers and editors are buying a whole bunch of this, don't write this, because by the time you get it written and submitted, everybody will be doing something else. Does that make sense?
I'm going to agree with what pretty much everyone has said, but the one thing I will add is that many publishers, us included, will also list things that they don't want to see. So they'll tell you what the tropes are that they're tired of. And as I said, we have it's not actually a very long list, but I don't want to see werewolves and vampires and time travel. Those stories just almost never work for me. I do leave a little bit of an out if you've done something really remarkable. And of course, that means everybody thinks that their story is remarkable. It's almost always not remarkable. Time travel stories don't work for me. Some people love them, I just don't. But many magazines will tell you what they don't want to see. And it's just my general rule for reading the guidelines in general. Read the guidelines because they're telling you what people want to get. And why would you send them something that they don't want? They're just going to reject it, and it's going to waste everybody's time. So read the guidelines, including the bits about the tropes that they don't want to see. Other questions?
Well, I'm going to go for round two.
Sure.
And since the other young lady, now I just aged myself, didn't I? The other young lady is getting published. I guess I want to say too that I'm having a reprint published in Abyss and Apex in January also. And I'm very excited. It's just been a wild ride, a fun ride. I'm into a genre that I never thought I would get into, and all of a sudden I'm writing a sequel to a story already. So I'm pretty excited about that. But I was kind of, to follow up, my question has to do with the romance. You said urban fiction. I forgot the exact term, but it was what Walt said, I think.
Urban fantasy.
Urban fantasy.
Thank you. Urban fantasy is tired, but if you throw some romance in there, or if you build it on a romance, then maybe that's something. As I don't know, as I've been looking around at what a lot of different magazines want, even though they state, and I read very carefully what they want, even though they state a certain thing, I mean, I have plenty of those rejection notices that say, thank you, it's just not a good fit, but we love your writing, blah, blah, blah. But, and I get it. I'm never upset about those things. I learn every time I get one. And I like to ask questions about it, you know, because romance, it seemed to me like that was very tired. Is that kind of coming around again?
I'll give everybody a chance at this. Certainly the president of SIFWA is a romance writer, and there's now a committee or a group in SIFWA that discusses romance and SFF. So there's certainly interest on that side. I mean, I like a good romantic story. I guess I wouldn't say that I like romance in the sense of bodice rippers and heaving bosoms, but if it's a romantic story in the kind of the Mary Stuart sense, I'm all for that. Whether it's and if it's speculative, then great, we'll look to publishing it. But I'm happy to read and enjoy that kind of thing. So I don't know if it's a resurgence, but it's certainly something that I enjoy. Kanika, do you want to take that first? Second?
Yeah, I will just say that we are open to all genres, subgenres within speculative fiction, but we are not looking for work that that follows strict conventions, or you know, for example, if you are writing for the romance reader, right, then you have to have that happy ending, right? There are certain things that are considered okay to do in a romance, then certain things that are considered not okay to do. So I guess we are fine with something that has romance or romantic elements in it. but we're not looking for what would be called a conventional romance that ticks off certain boxes or, follows a certain trajectory. We would not be a good market for that. I don't have anything against that. It's just not what we do. Right. So, and we are also not looking at trends, other than just like, we are getting way too many of these kinds of stories and they're just not interesting to us, or we just published several stories of this type, and so we want to publish a variety of work. So we want to publish some different kinds of work before we, like if we did publish a vampire unicorn story and then we got another vampire unicorn story that we thought was fantastic, right? We might say, well, vampire unicorns are very specific, right? So like we probably don't want to publish 2 of those in a row, but if we like it a lot, we might say, would you be okay with us holding on to it and publishing it a few issues later? But otherwise, we're not making our decisions based on what the trends are.
Yeah. Walt.
I didn't mean to say that romance was somehow in. It's what urban fantasy is trending toward. Instead of bodice rippers, there are now 6-pack rippers and things like that. I have a good friend who writes those under a pseudonym, and they're her best-selling works. So there's a market out there. I don't want to write for it, and I don't want to read it, but that's good. More power to them. I'm completely in agreement with Kanika about if I've published something that's really good and then I get something that's also really good that's along the same lines, like the vampire unicorns, I would either reject the second one or say do a rewrite so that it's not quite so vampire unicorn, or I'd do the same thing that you said, Kanika. I'd say, would you mind if I hold this for 2 or 3 issues? I'll give you a contract now, so you know that I'm not just sitting on it, but I'm not going to publish it until back along somewhere. You have to keep your publication fresh, and publishing too much of the same thing doesn't do that.
I really appreciate that. Could I just add, it's not that I specifically am looking at like political or romance. I'm just trying to see how it is that you think about these things. And I understand that mixing it up and making it interesting. Obviously, if the editor or the publishers don't like it, then you might as well go write on a blog like I do. And anyways, I don't know. I just really appreciate all of you. I thank you so much for answering my questions.
Wendy, did you want to add anything to that?
Sure. The stories that I buy usually have what's called heart. They kind of get you in the feels, because Abyss and Apex originally is supposed to be the abyss and apex of human emotions. Some of those are negative, some are positive. One of the very positive ones is human interactions. Believe it or not, men do like stories that have a romantic plot or subplot. One of our most popular stories with guys is about a man who finds a woman drunk in a parking lot, and he brings her home and cleans her up, and it turns out she's an astronaut and she lost everybody on a ship, and she's about to go after their romance on a colony ship, and he's never going to see her again. And so he blows his way into the company and the part of his company that is doing the surveillance equipment to watch over her while she sleeps. And it just gets the guys and the women right in the feels the way it was written. Beautifully done. We have romantic subplots, but again, if you take out the colony ship, the story falls apart. So they're still speculative. They are not specifically romances, but they are about, sometimes they're about betrayal. Romances don't necessarily have a happy ending in speculative fiction. They may be about, these are the consequences of bad choices, which always makes an interesting story. But for me personally, because I write as well, I was an abuse survivor, and my first readers would look at my romantic subplots in my stories and say, he's a creep, because I didn't have any good role models until the wonderful marriage I have now. So it's something that an older writer does better, I think. And an older editor picks up on better, because we understand how human nature works, not just romance, but all of the beautiful messiness that is humanity should be in a story.
Wonderful.
I just want to add one thing, just to give you a feeling that editors do things in different ways. We don't have themed issues, and I buy stories in advance and then fit together issues that I think make sense. But I do from time to time have stories that come in that have a similar feeling or have similar issues. They're not specifically vampire unicorn kind of stories, but I do the opposite maybe of what Walt and Kanika say. And I sometimes will double down on that and say, okay, let's have an issue that deals with vampire unicorns.
I'm so sorry you brought up vampire unicorns.
Well,
what do we talk about vampire unicorns?
Exactly. But I mean, I will do that as long as they're of a similar quality. I mean, I don't want to embarrass anybody and say we had one terrific vampire unicorn story and one lousy one. That's not good. Hopefully we wouldn't be buying the lousy one. But I will do that. And so we've often had occasions where there's an issue that has 2 or 3 even stories that are in some way similar. And I don't call it a themed issue, but it's like, all right, this is the one about family relationships or among vampire unicorns or whatever it may be. So different ways of dealing with that same kind of issue. We've got.
Yeah, and I'll just say that. Sorry, we have done that as well, where in a particular submission period, we see several stories that we like that have the same kinds of concerns, right? And we will kind of unofficially combine them into a kind of thematic issue. We weren't looking for a theme. We don't say it has a theme, but these stories all end up being in conversation with one another in some way. So we will do that as well.
Our subconscious made a theme, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, we were sending out certain vibes. Yeah. Or it's something in the air culturally. But yeah, so we will do that as well. I think it's more when there's something very specific, like the Mothman. I'm gonna put aside the vampire unicorns. When there's something as specific as like a Mothman character, we probably don't want an entire Mothman issue. And in that case, we might spread those stories out. But if it's like broader concerns or areas of interest that are shared among the stories, then we will often look for stories that are ending up being in conversation with one another.
I did want to say one last thing on this, if I could, Morris. I didn't mean to imply that men don't like romances. They certainly do. I give you as a sterling example, Sharon Lee and Steve Miller, who've been writing romances for 30 years. And it's Regency romances in space. And it works extremely well. And there's a lot of guys, including myself, that really, really are fans.
We've got probably time for one more question, then I'm going to give all of the panelists a chance to have some final words and promote anything that they've got coming up. And I'll ask all of you on the panel, when you do that, to again remind us of who you are and what magazine you're affiliated with. The other thing for participants to be aware of, on the page where you probably found the sign up link, which is industry.metaphorosis / ask the editors, I think. There's a list of all the people who are involved in this. And also in the recording that I post on YouTube probably tomorrow, it'll have names and web addresses and so on. So you can always look up who it was that you were hearing these pearls of wisdom from. So one more question if there is one, and then we'll go to that. Tammy, if you have one more in your long list of questions, feel free, but otherwise, that's fine.
I always have questions. Cover letters. What do you guys really want to see in them? Are they really that important?
I'm going to go first with that because my answer is very simple. I actually got Matt Kressel, who produces the Moksha submissions system, to do away with the cover letter field or make it optional. I don't want to see a cover letter at all. I have no interest in knowing anything about you until I've read the story. All our reading is anonymous. So after I read the story and make a decision, I will usually de-anonymize just so that I see what the names are and I can recognize them. But I don't want to know anything about you or the story until I've decided whether I want to offer you a rewrite or not. So there is no cover letter at all for us. Sometimes people try to work one in, even though we ask them not to, and please don't do that. But, Walt.
I'm with you. I think cover letters are an abuse of electrons unnecessarily. Send us your story. If the story stands, we'll find out who you are and send you money.
Wendy?
We request a cover letter, and all we want is for you to say, this is my name, this is the name of my story, this is how many words it is. Maybe give us 3 things you've had published, maybe nothing, we don't care. Do not tell us what the story is going to be about. Do not give us a curriculum vitae, please. We don't need your resume, we just need to know. And what's interesting is I don't really look at it until I've finished reading the story or I've decided to reject it. And I learned that trick from Sheila Williams at Asimov. She doesn't read the cover letter until she's done. Because she, like you, Maura, she doesn't want to have the name recognition. We have a horrible problem. People that are big name authors, I'm not going to mention any names, have stories that they haven't been able to sell. So since we're just semi-pro, they say, well, we'll just see if Annie will take it. And I look at it and I go, I can see why you didn't sell that. Okay. But had I looked at it, I might have been swayed by the name recognition of the person. And I don't want that. There's one exception, and this circles back to something you talked about earlier, Walt. It's, or was it you, Morris? I forget. We keep seeing the same names. You may not realize it, but we editors are rooting for you as we see you get better and better and better. It's like, finally something by this person. I kind of like the last 3. This one's even better. And then the next one we're buying is how it ends up happening 9 times out of 10. But anyhow, I'm Wendy S. Delmater. I run Apex magazine. And we absolutely are excited about having a reading period for the first time in a year and a half. We were so overstocked, we just closed for all of 2023. We're having one in February, and we invite you and your buddies to send us stuff.
Walt.
I'm Walt Boys. For the last 20 years, I've edited magazines in both nonfiction and fiction. I edited Eric Flint's Grantville Gazette for the last 10 years of its existence. Currently, I'm trying to get my boss at Novus Mundi Publishing to fork over enough cash for me to start a magazine. I'm not getting anywhere yet, so maybe I'll have to do a Kickstarter and go on my own with it. But I love the genre. I love magazines. I love the short story format, and I didn't think I was ever going to until I started actually editing science fiction magazines. I didn't much like short stories. Now I love them. They are wonderful. I like novels too, don't get me wrong, but I love short stories.
Okay, Kanika.
On the cover letter question, I'll just say that we do ask for a cover letter. Our website says what we would like you to include in the cover letter. So, follow those guidelines. In addition, we find it useful to have a cover letter, even if a lot of readers or editors don't read the cover letter until after they've read the story. We do find it useful to have a cover letter because we are actively looking to consider and publish stories that are outside of Western traditions of speculative fiction. We want work from people all over the world. And, there may be stories that we are not reading fully or understanding fully because of the ways in which they are borrowing from other traditions or speaking out of other cultural contexts. And we don't see that as a problem with the story, right? We see it then as our job to learn more about that context, that tradition. We don't see our publication as being, directed only towards a Western audience or towards an audience that's familiar with only one kind of speculative tradition. So, sometimes it can be useful to have, for a writer to briefly say, hey, my story is working with this tradition or with, within this cultural context or whatever. But as Wendy said, we don't want an explanation of the story. We don't want you to sell us the story in the cover letter. And we don't want you to try to convince us that we should be a different kind of publication. For example, we are a publication for immigrant and diaspora authors. Don't try to convince us in your cover letter that is discriminatory, and we should not. We should publish anyone and everyone, and we should not limit our publication to immigrant and diaspora authors, right? Just send your work elsewhere. There's lots of publications. So I'm sure nobody here does that, but that's just something we have seen at times. And that's a bad strategy that's likely to get you blacklisted at certain publications. We have not so far blacklisted anyone, but have just, if they send us a letter like that, we let them know this is not for you. There are many other publications that are available for you. As for khōréō, we have 4 reading periods every year. Each reading period is open for a month. Usually we do, occasionally we will have so many, we will end up with a backlog because we've received so much work that we want to publish, and we won't hold a submission, we'll skip a submission period. But usually we will have those 4 submission periods, one of which will be themed. And currently we are talking about expanding into other. So right now we publish only fiction. We used to publish fiction and nonfiction. We are having conversations right now about opening up to possibly to nonfiction again, or to other genres. We're also looking at perhaps a focus on translated work. So, you know, as always, sort of make sure that before you submit, you have looked up the website, you know, not like, you know, 6 months ago, but that, you know, you're looking it up now, because things do often change. What we're looking for, what we are now open to, often changes. Yeah, just keep current with what a particular publication wants.
Okay, and I'm Morris Allen from Metaphorosis, and my only announcement is that we're actually closed to submissions right now for the first time ever. So we'll see. Watch this space for more information. Thank you all for participating on the panel in the audience. Remember that we do this every month, so we'll do another one next on the first Saturday of September, and we hope to see you then.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So very interesting. Thank you.
Thanks all.